Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today at our webinar to learn a little bit more about subminimum wage. We're going to wait just a few more minutes so that we can have all of our attendees log in and join us. So we will get started in about a minute or two, so thank you for your patience. Okay, everyone, just one more minute or so and we can get started. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our NDSS DSWorks webinar. This is our second webinar in our 2018 DSWorks webinar series. So we appreciate you all coming and learning a little bit more about our DSWorks program and how we can continue to make the world a better place for all individuals with Down syndrome and individuals with disabilities as well. My name is Colleen, and I am the Community Outreach and Engagement Manager at the National Down Syndrome Society. I wanted to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded and will be sent to you following the presentation. It will also be posted on our website and our YouTube page for you to view and share with your friends, family, and colleagues following the webinar. If you have any questions, you are all on mute, but you can ask questions in the question column or in the chat column of your control panel. We will answer all questions at the end. We will leave a few minutes to respond to any questions or comments you have. And my colleagues will give you their information so you can reach out following the webinar via email as well. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Ashley, who is the Director of Government Relations at the National Down Syndrome Society.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon about the very, very important topic of subminimum wage. NDSS is the leading human rights organization for all individuals with Down syndrome, and we really view subminimum wage as an issue of human rights. So we are working to change it. Next slide. So here is a breakdown of our DSWorks program. It is our employment program here at NDSS. We provide employment resources, employment training and career placement, employer partnerships, and what we are going to be addressing today is ending loss syndrome. Next slide. So loss syndrome is the idea that it's not Down syndrome that has ever held anybody back, but rather antiquated laws, exactly like subminimum wage, that are holding people back from fulfilling their dreams and attaining their goals. So we do have a couple of special guests on the line today. We have Kimmy with National Federation of the Blind. We have Anne and Phoebe from the National Council on Disability. The three of our organizations work very, very closely on subminimum wage. We are, trying to get rid of Section 14C in the Fair Labor Standards Act. So I will actually pass it over to them, and they can kick us off with some explanations of what subminimum wage is and ways that we are trying to address it.
Hi, Ashley. This is Kimmy, and thank you so much for inviting the National Federation of the Blind to be part of your webinar today. So one of the questions I'm here to answer is, what is subminimum wage? So under Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act, employers can apply for what is known as a special wage certificate from the Department of Labor, which allows them to pay people with disabilities less than the federal minimum wage. And so
what is subminimum wage? Subminimum wage, as we found in our 2012 report, to put it quite simply, is discriminatory. The National Council on Disability examines the subminimum wage issue from many different angles and found that 14C is a policy relic from the 1930s when discrimination was inevitable because service systems were based on a charity model rather than empowerment and self-determination. Perhaps not surprising that it's inconsistent with civil rights laws such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, since there's a half a century between the creation of 14C and the passage of the ADA. So the National Council on Disability, which is an advisory committee to the President and Congress, has always stood for the principle that no person with a disability should be discriminated against in an employment setting by paying less than the minimum wage available to all other citizens. People with disabilities need rent-paying employment, as our co-presenter said in a previous talk that we gave about subminimum wage. And I just love that phrase, rent-paying employment, that offers a way out of the cycle of poverty. What NCD found when we did our report, when we examined subminimum wage employment, is that rather than providing opportunity, people tend to become trapped in subminimum wage employment and never move on to real jobs at competitive wages.
And we're ready for the next slide. NCD did research in 2012, and actually beginning in 2011, we went around the country and we examined a bunch of site visits. And we went into different environments. We went into urban settings and we went into rural settings, and we went into a number of different states to see what the experiences of people with disabilities in those states were. Some of them were in sheltered workshop environments making less than minimum wage, and others were using job coaches and other supports and were making more than minimum wage. So we went in and we did that research. We also looked at all available national data at the time, and one of those was the 2001 Government Accountability Office report. And I wanted to just mention briefly some of the findings of that report. In 2001, GAO did a study on subminimum wages, and they found that 95% of people who were receiving below minimum wage were working in sheltered workshops. Now, for anybody on the phone that doesn't know what a sheltered workshop is, sheltered workshops are buildings where people with disabilities are segregated away from the community and are typically employed doing what's called piecemeal work. Sometimes they're putting items in a bag or licking envelopes or that kind of thing, but they're doing it over and over and over every day. Originally, sheltered workshops were supposed to be a place where people with disabilities could get job skills to go to work in the community, but what GAO found in 2001 was that only 5% of people with disabilities in those workshops were ever leaving for jobs in the community. So they're definitely not trying very hard to help people with disabilities get job skills. The GAO report also looked at subminimum wages in sheltered workshops, but also looked at people with disabilities working in supported employment settings. Now, for anyone unfamiliar with the phrase supported employment is a stepping stone for a lot of people with disabilities for greater self-sufficiency. It helps pair employees with disabilities with unique supports to train them to do a particular job. So not unlike most of us, when we take a new job, we don't really know what we're doing until somebody shows us what to do. So supported employment is very similar in principle. Sometimes people will have job coaches, or they'll have very intense training for a few weeks or months to help them learn the job before they're able to do it on their own. And what GAO found in their 2001 report was not a surprise to us at all. It was that basically people with disabilities who use supported employment over time cost the system less money, but people who continue to be employed in sheltered workshop jobs actually cost more money to the system over time. So what was intended to be a training grounds, these sheltered workshops have really become silos of segregation for people with disabilities in dead-end jobs. And we're ready for the next slide. So one of the things that we heard when we went around the country to these different site visits, and another thing that we're hearing even now when we're sometimes in congressional offices, is this common misconception that some people are just too disabled to work. Now, I imagine that there are any number of people on the phone who have also heard that either in their personal life or related to a loved one. And we know that that is just not true, that a lot of times the limitations on people with disabilities are the ones that society places on us and really nothing more. But that is the misconception that's really prominent, that's continuing to allow people to justify paying people with disabilities less than minimum wages because they believe that they are just too disabled to work. Now, I would encourage everybody on this phone call, if you haven't already had the opportunity to see the movie Rooted in Rights, the movie on subminimum wage employment, I would strongly encourage you to do so, because once you do, you'll see lots of examples of people with the most profound disabilities working in their communities at or above minimum wage jobs. And certainly, I'm sure we could be on the phone a long time telling each other stories of people we know from our communities and the jobs that we have, of people who have been expected little of from society, but who have shattered those expectations again and again. So again, whenever you are advocating around these issues, you might hear people say, but isn't it true that some people just can't work? And what NCD believes, and what all of you believe, I'm sure too, is that with the right supports, anyone with a disability can be employed. And so that's the message we really want to hammer home today.
All right. So one of the things we know now since 1938 is that we now have the Americans with Disabilities Act, we have the Rehabilitation Act, we have Individuals with Disability Education Act, and all of these disability policies focus on integration and the abilities of people with disabilities. All of the current disability laws presume that people with disabilities are capable just like everyone else. So what we know is that 14C is inconsistent with current disability policies. So one of the solutions we have is the TIME Act. This is the Transitioning to Integrated and Meaningful Employment Act. This is HR 1377, and it was introduced by Congressman Greg Harper of Mississippi, who is a father of a child with an intellectual disability. And what it intends to do is start this transition into integrated employment opportunities, just like everyone else. So under this law, under the legislation, the proposed legislation, the Department of Labor would no longer be able to issue special wage certificates. There would be no new certificates. And for the current certificate holders, in order to renew their certificate, it creates conditions for renewal. So now the employers would have to start conducting individualized assessments of the people being paid subminimum wage and identify what supports have been provided to these individuals, what is needed to help them get into an integrated setting. And then in the end, it would ultimately phase out all 14C certificates after 6 years, which is a very long transition period. Let's see.
Next slide.
Yeah, next slide. So one of the things that we are really excited about the TIME Act is that it does have bipartisan support. It was introduced in both the Democratic and the Republican platforms in 2016. And ultimately, it recognizes the abilities of people with disabilities. We know that people with disabilities are able to do plenty of things. We have people that have quadriplegics who are doing wonderful things. So we just want to create the presumption that people with disabilities are able to work.
Next slide.
Next slide.
So as Kimmy was saying, the writing is on the wall for subminimum wage employment. The TIME Act is gaining some traction in the legislative body and at the federal level, and both parties have embraced the concept of eliminating 14C. But also, many states have taken action to eliminate 14C. Legislation has been passed at the state level in Alaska, Vermont, Maryland, and New Hampshire. In 2000, Vermont became the first state to ban sheltered workshops, and in 2015, New Hampshire became the first state to ban the use of subminimum wage, and that they've been followed by Maryland in 2016 and Alaska just this past week. The integrated, so that sort of raises the question, does this work for people with disabilities? Are people with disabilities gaining integrated employment in the states that have banned the use of subminimum wage? And it seems to be the case that they are. In Vermont, for example, which was the state that stopped using sheltered workshops in 2000, the integrated employment rate of people with developmental disabilities is 38%. That's compared with the national rate of employment in that population of 18%. So clearly, this works for people with disabilities. In 2014, Rhode Island also entered into a settlement agreement with the Department of Justice in response to a lawsuit that said that sheltered workshops violated the Americans with Disabilities Act. Under this agreement, the state has to provide supported employment placements in typical jobs in the community that pay at least minimum wage, provide supports for integrated non-work activities for times when people are not working, including integrated educational opportunities, leisure opportunities, and volunteer activities. They also have to provide transition services for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities starting at age 14, and these can include internships, job site visits, and mentoring, and the things that will enable students to leave school prepared for jobs in the community at competitive wages. Another important lawsuit was in Oregon. In February of 2015, in response to a lawsuit that the Department of Justice joined, Governor Kitzhaber issued an executive order that's intended to guide people with severe disabilities into jobs in the general workforce. The order sets up a plan to provide job training, internships, and work experiences to high school special education students so that when they leave school, they can join the workforce instead of being segregated into sheltered workshops. Another case was in Ohio, when an administrative law judge from the Department of Labor ruled that subminimum wages violated the rights of 3 workers in particular because they could do the work at regular speed and their productivity was at sort of a regular level, and so they were having their rights violated by participating in 14C. So that was a really interesting example of the ADA applying to specific workers. And following that, officials with the Federal Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services said that the programs in Ohio were too segregated and must be revamped. So the state is now on track to basically integrate their system by 2019, although that might be extended. That's still, situation is still going. Hawaii also has competing bills in the House and Senate that could possibly eliminate subminimum wage. New Mexico is also taking some steps. So a lot of states are moving on their own, even in advance of the federal government moving to eliminate subminimum wage, because it really is time for this policy relic to be on the dustbin of history, as we like to say. Next slide.
So as Phoebe mentioned, we're seeing a downward trend across the nation in the utilization of subminimum wages. So that's a real positive. When we did the report in 2012, we used statistics that were available at the time, and there were over 400,000 people with disabilities being paid subminimum wages at the time. And since that time, things have really changed. And we're actually looking at less than 200,000 people with disabilities being paid subminimum wages at this time, and that's just in the 6 years since the report was written.
There's been a downward trend, as Ann was saying. In 2010, 164,000 people were being paid subminimum wages. Or no, I'm sorry, in 2010, 420,000 people were being paid subminimum wages. Now it's only 164,000. We also recently had a Hill briefing with representatives from agencies that used to use a sheltered workshop subminimum wage model who've transitioned and are now paying real wages. And we're collecting these stories to show providers, families, and people with disabilities that it can be done.
And so one of the things we are really excited about is that we are finding that many of these providers that formerly had 14C certificates are voluntarily withdrawing their certificates. And when we interview them and we ask them, you know, how do you feel about the transition? And they said, we should have done this sooner. Everyone has said we should have done this sooner. And it's been a positive change for their program.
And we're ready for the next slide. Sorry, thank you.
Sorry, and then also too, on these slides, we put together some transition profiles of 2 providers that spoke at our most recent briefings. And you'll see that there's a lot of common fears and that everyone has had, but they've overcome them through the resources and support.
Next slide.
Yeah, next slide.
So one of these profiles that I'll just spend a couple of minutes going through is Vedas. Now, Vedas was an interesting one for a couple of reasons. We had the CEO of this former sheltered workshop provider come to our briefing. They no longer have any subminimum wage employment and they don't use sheltered workshops anymore. And what he had to say, which was very consistent with what Kimmy just mentioned, was they wish they had done this sooner. And it was it was the most extremely proud moment of a lot of the leadership of Vedas's executive staff. It was the most proud moment of their professional lives, was getting rid of their 14C certificate. What he had to share with us was really interesting for a few reasons. Vedas, unlike a lot of the other providers, is located in Seattle, Washington. Now, if any of you have been following the news about national wages, you'll know that Seattle, Washington actually has, I believe, a $15 an hour minimum wage. That's well above the federal minimum wage. So they not only had to make a commitment to get rid of sub-minimum wages, they had to make a commitment in the process of their transition to get everyone up to $15 an hour minimum. So this, we really liked to show this profile in particular as an example of where there's a will, there's a way, and they were able to do this. So we've included a couple of the highlights of the transition profile they turned in. And what was really interesting is over and over and over again, we heard that the challenges to transition were attitudes, fear, resistance, like culturally speaking at the leadership levels, and organizational realignment. One of the CEO's main points at our briefing in November was that they had a lot of money tied up in real estate. And what they meant by that was, we mentioned that sheltered workshops are essentially buildings that people with disabilities go to do piecemeal work. Well, if organizations make commitments to get away from 14C, they have to figure out what they're going to do with those buildings and how they're going to kind of repurpose them. And so there's a lot of resistance organizationally in making some of the changes because they have to make hard decisions and big decisions about how to do things differently. But what the stories have been consistently coming back with is, again, when they decided that there was a will to do it, they all put their brains together and decided we're not going to expend energy figuring out how to maintain what we've been doing. We're going to expend our energy figuring out how we're going to evolve into something else. And so what was really interesting about their profile is they had a $5.3 million annual budget. They had a small workshop of 35 people, and they had a large workshop of 150 people. And they were also able to transition all of those people out of sheltered workshops and into competitive integrated employment at or above minimum wages. So again, people who would otherwise never have experienced real jobs in their communities, now they do. And again and again and again, we're hearing from providers who are telling us that before their state compelled them to do it, before there was an executive order, before the feds made a law that required them to do it, they voluntarily did it. They did it without extra money. They did it because they decided it was the right thing to do. And there was no looking back, and none of them have regretted it. So that's a story that we're hearing again and again from all size providers. Next slide.
Thanks so much, Anne. This is Ashley jumping in, and you know, one of the biggest things that we hear most often is, oh, you know, people will lose their jobs, companies will go out of business, and we're in the process of collecting these stories to show that it's not true and that it is possible to get rid of a certificate and have the company thrive and the employees thrive. So now we get to the part of the presentation where I get to tell you what you can do to help. You can absolutely sign up for our action alerts on our website, ndss.org. I know many of you on the webinar actually already get those, I'm sure, but we send out action alerts periodically. We just sent one out for the Time Act, and you have all the information to email your members of Congress and their offices to be supportive of this legislation. You can call your representatives and ask them to co-sponsor the Time Act. It's really important. We are doing a big push on our end to see this legislation through, and we need to show that there's political support for it. So really the most important thing right now that you can do for sub-minimum wage is to ask your representatives to co-sponsor. And then you can also attend our Buddy Walk on Washington and our Adult Summit on April 9th, 10th, and 11th. The Time Act is going to be one of our legislative asks this year. I know some of you have attended before, and we always have a list of bills that we talk about with our members, but this will definitely be our number one priority this year for sure. So we're really, really excited about that. Next slide. And here are some different ways that you can get involved with DSWorks. You can advocate for legislative agenda items, which we just went over exactly how you can do that. You can share an employment success story. So if you know somebody with Down syndrome who is working, who has their own business, please let us know. We love, love, love sharing those stories because they are so important for people to see that people with Down syndrome are working. You can become a strategic partner. If you have a business and you want to hire people with Down syndrome, definitely get in touch. Yeah, there are some other ways up there as well. And none of this would be possible without our current DSWorks partnerships. We work really, really closely with these businesses who want to employ people with Down syndrome. We have some really, really great success stories from these businesses. Blake Snow Shack, Blake Pyron, started his own Snow Shack food truck down in Sanger, Texas, and he's always an amazing partner to have. The NHL hired 2 people with Down syndrome after hosting them for internships, and they just loved them so much that they hired them on. Alex Partners, same. They've had two interns with Down syndrome as well, and Bimbo and Voya are in the process of hiring folks. And here's the team that works on DSWorks. We have Emily and Candy and myself. I put my email there in case you have any questions about what we are working on to end Law syndrome or any other legislative pieces that we are working on. Colleen, who's been so helpful on this webinar today, and our colleague, Adrian. So please, if you have any questions about DSWorks, feel free to reach out to any of us. Thank you all so much for joining. I do think we have a couple of questions. So Colleen, if you could go through those, that would be great.
Of course. So Robin Lyons wrote, our Employment First bill just passed. This bill sets up a model of integrated community employment at competitive wages. I just got an employer on board who will be hiring 30 people. Thank you, Robin. Maureen also wrote, Massachusetts eliminated funding for all sheltered workshops about a year ago. And those were all the questions. Let me check the chat. I think that was it for questions. So if anyone has a question that you quickly want to type up and send to us, please let us know. But I'm sure Ashley and the rest of the team who is on the call today would be happy to answer any questions you have after the webinar is over. Robin again asked, where can we get specifics about the bill?
Sure. So you can go to congress.gov and type in HR 1377, and that will give you the text of the bill. Or you can email me, Kimmy Ekobachi, at the National Federation of the Blind, and we have a fact sheet that I can send to you. My email is keacobacci@nsb.org, or if you contact Ashley, she can forward your email to me.
Absolutely.
Okay, we've got a couple more. What is the name of the film that was referenced earlier?
Sure. So it's called The Transitioning to Integrated and Meaningful.
No, not the film. Film. Yeah.
Oh, Bottom Dollars. Bottom Dollars is the name.
And it's by an organization called Rooted in Rights.
All right, Maureen asks, what tips do you have for parents who are concerned about this?
Well, I think, one thing that has been stressed in all the states that have eliminated subminimum wage or that are working in that direction is that transition really is the key. That crucial age, between, 14 and I'd say about 22, building those expectations, making sure that young people with disabilities understand, that competitive integrated employment is not only an option, it's an expectation. And I think that that's something that that not only helping young people understand, but helping families understand, and also the systems that provide those supports need to understand that that is the expectation that we have for young adults with disabilities, as we do for all young adults, and that people should have options and be able to find competitive integrated employment that is fulfilling for them, and again is rent paying employment, so that they can have independent and fulfilling lives.
I just want to add, though, too, parents have a very valuable voice in Congress, so they should call their members of Congress and say, I don't want my child to be paid subminimum wages, so please co-sponsor HR 1377.
We have another question. Is there anything in the bill that protects benefits of individuals who get increased wages?
As of right now, this is just focusing on getting people to minimum wage. So I would say no.
But let me add, this is Phoebe. I would also like to add there are lots of programs. There's 1619B, which is a program through Social Security that allows folks to continue working while receiving SSI and continue to receive Medicaid, even if they no longer receive the SSI as an income benefit. So there are lots of ways to work and still maintain your benefits. And so that's something that I think folks need to be able to explore, and that's one of the recommendations in the NCD report, is that people have access to robust benefits counseling that will help them, make that transition and still retain the services that they need while relying more and more on, on competitive employment for their income support rather than the benefits.
Great. Kathleen writes, was there a survey done on how parents of adults who work in sheltered workshops react to the changes?
Great question. This is Ann. We didn't do a formal survey, but we spoke to parents at all 7 of our site visits. And as you can well imagine, we've met many parents along the way, both before and after the report, who have strong opinions. One of the things that I would say was a trend line across our experiences at the site visits, meeting with parents, was the majority of parents who opposed closing sheltered workshops and getting rid of subminimum wage became converts when it happened against their will. So as one example, we've done 2 briefings, one in November that we did most recently, and then we did another one in July. The one in July, we involved a family that had been through this generationally. And what I mean by that was, one of the women that we had met in Vermont when we did a site visit in Vermont was a founder of a sheltered workshop. So she had a lot of skin in the game. She had an adult daughter who was in the sheltered workshop her entire adult life. And she and her husband had actually founded the sheltered workshop. So you can imagine how opposed she was to its closure and the cessation of paying subminimum wages in that environment. However, as the transition moved forward against her will, and her daughter was put into a variety of career exploration activities, which ultimately resulted in her being employed part-time and in volunteer services that she found extremely fulfilling, she actually came to exhibit personality and preferences that her family never knew she even had. And through the process, although they began firmly opposed to the transition, they came out on the other side and they were its staunchest supporters. So she actually came full circle and came and testified before the National Council on Disability in support of our report and of the findings that recommended the elimination of 14C. So I mentioned that anecdotally as just one example of, generally speaking, parents always, and we know this, we know that parents are trying to do right by their kids. And so whatever is available to them at the time, or what they've been told is available to them at the time, a lot of times that's why parents are funneling their kids into these environments, because they're not aware of what's available and how it can work for their kid. But what we're finding is, as they have exposure to that and the transitions occur, the parents are absolutely in the camp of, we should have done this earlier. This has been great for our family.
Few more questions. Can you send the links to the reports you referred to with the statistics? And Ashley, I think you can speak for this too, but I think hopefully we can ask you all to send us the links and we can compile them together and put them when we send the webinars out to our attendees.
Yep, absolutely. We can get those to you.
Could people work in sheltered workshops and be paid fair wages if parents and adults choose that route?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, yes, right now it is legal in not every state as we outlined, but in a lot of states it still is a legal option. Sheltered workshops in general, and also the wages. If I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying could people continue being paid like at a competitive wage or a minimum wage, but in a sheltered environment? Is that the question?
Yes, I believe so.
So the Time Act doesn't end sheltered workshops and the sheltered workshop. It's just getting the providers to pay minimum wage and give them opportunities to have other opportunities in the community. But the under 14C, it doesn't close the workshop itself. It just takes away their certificate. That allows them to pay some minimum wages. Sorry.
The next question comes from Robin. We constantly hear it's a transportation issue. I had one parent say she knows it's bad, but the bus comes to her house.
And so I would say that I have spoken with the provider, especially in Tennessee. That was one of their biggest issues was transportation. And what they did was there's plenty of grants out there, they found out, to get funding for transportation programs. So I would strongly recommend, like, if you have questions about that, there's plenty of providers that we could probably recommend that have identified several resources available to different programs.
And I believe, too, that we're actually having a meeting a little bit later today with the Office of Disability Employment Policy. And they have begun providing a certain degree of technical assistance to individuals who are interested in pursuing some of that information. So we can provide that information to Ashley after the fact, too.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Great. Angela writes, NJ Wins is an organization that can help with keeping benefits and earning wages. They will assist with any questions. One DD budget will provide funding for supported employment. Norma writes, did all those shelter workshops receive jobs when the workshops were closed? All those in sheltered workshops receive jobs when those workshops were closed?
Well, again, I don't think that we can make any guarantees that, you know, when workshops are closed in some of the states that have stopped using that model, that every single person will get a job. But, you know, the facts speak for themselves. And in Vermont, where they closed the sheltered workshops, you know, first in 2000, the employment rate of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is more than twice that of the national statistics. So, you know, again, I think we would certainly want for people to find either competitive integrated employment or something, you know, maybe it's a volunteer opportunity, maybe it's some other path. You know, certainly competitive integrated employment is not the path for everybody, whether they're disabled or not. But certainly we would hope that folks would find a meaningful thing to do during the day. And the statistics do show that once you close the sheltered workshops, people with disabilities are more successful in competitive integrated employment.
I just wanted to add as well, too, that National Industries for the Blind, which is a program under Ability One like Source America and a lot of the providers for intellectual disabilities, they got rid of their 14C certificate at a national level several years ago, and they still have people working in their programs, but now they're being paid above minimum wage. They have benefits just like every other employee does. So we know that it's worked for the Industries for the Blind, so hopefully other providers will also do the same.
Great. And then we just have one last comment from Kathleen, and she said, thank you for the great response. I'm thinking that choices should be offered.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, if no one has any final questions, I will turn it over to you guys to answer any last minute thoughts you want to, address.
Well, we just want to thank you for inviting us to speak in your webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to let Ashley know and she'll forward your questions on to us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kimmy and Anne and Phoebe for joining us for this webinar. We so appreciate your time and your amazing and valuable information. Again, if there are any questions at all about the Time Act, subminimum wage, go ahead and shoot me an email, Helsing, HEL, S as in Sam, ING, at ndss.org. Thank you all so much for tuning in.
Great. And just a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the NDSS website as well as our YouTube page. And everyone who has registered for this event today will receive it in an email shortly within the next day or so. Again, if you have any questions, please let us know. You can always reach out to NDSS with any questions you have about individuals with Down syndrome and what we're doing as an organization. And you can always reach us at info@ndss.org. And we wish you a happy Monday. And, please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.